Hey everyone, thanks. Welcome again to the latest installment, the 101st installment of The Way It Is. And I'm your host, Luca with Team Luca First at Remax Service First Realty. And if you ring the bell, share, do all the links and everything like that, would appreciate it. We are very fortunate today in light of recent events in the province of Ontario. And for those of you that follow along, I'm happy to have Amber Crawford, who's the Senior Policy Advisor of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. And we're talking Bill 23. And so for those of you that, I guess, just shut out the news every day and haven't heard about this bill, it's the Homes Built Faster Now bill that the government of Ontario proposed during the election and then literally fast-tracked to yesterday. It went live, if I'm not mistaken. So
2 days.
2 days ago. My apologies. So Amber, thank you for coming and welcome.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So before we get into the real nitty gritty and the nuts and bolts of it, I'm not going to lie to you. I've never heard of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. So can you give us just a brief little synopsis of the history of it, the derivation of it? Where did this thing come from, I guess? So
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I think the first start, I won't bore you through all the historical details, but it did get established in 1899, and really has the same impact in terms of the regular meetings with municipal governments and the province in terms of influencing legislation. It has gone through some iterations, but we were formerly known as AMO as of 1982. And what makes us unique in Canada, really, from other federal and territorial organizations is this idea that we have a signed memorandum of understanding with the province of Ontario. And so we're very proud of that. It's been enshrined in legislation since 2005 under the Municipal Act. And so we work very closely with them. But the other thing that makes us interesting is that we've got our members are elected councils. So we work with staff organizations, of course, but our elected councils are 444 in the province. Interestingly, the City of Toronto is separate because it has its own separate act. So anyone that's sort of covered under the Municipal Act is who we advocate on behalf of. But obviously, we share very common interests. Of the 444, some facts for you is that about 60% of them have less than 10,000 in population, which is substantial. 186 of those of the 270 have less than 5,000 in population, and 77 or the remainder have between 5 and 10,000 in population. We have 32% that have populations between 10,000 and 999, and then 9% that have over 100,000 population. The other thing that's interesting that we represent is the geographical distances. So between Windsor and Kenora is about a 17-hour drive. It's about over 1,600 kilometers. And from Toronto to Moosonee is about a 12-hour flight or 900 kilometers. So if you can imagine an important context for this conversation, certainly, is we address common challenges facing everyone, which, no one size fits all, clearly. And housing has been one of those top issues for a long time for us.
Yeah, well, and I think, I'm born and raised in Ontario, and I'm the first to sadly, I guess, embarrassingly admit that I've yet to really circumnavigate our province. And I mean, I'm of Italian heritage, and I think I was once told you can fit 7 Italys in the province of Ontario, which is a scary thought, a country of 70 plus million people. And here we are, one of the largest provinces in the nation. And so, yes, admittedly, that the challenges both geographically and logistically are pretty stark for sure. So Bill 23, Homes Built Faster Now Act. You guys have, I'll just read one of the news clippings. So serious concerns about the bill, which will have the effect of undermining the financial capacity of municipalities to support growth and diminishing essential environmental protections. AMO estimates up to $1 billion, that's billion with a B, in development costs could be passed from developers to taxpayers with little hope of achieving its goal of improving housing affordability. And the biggest knock against this bill, and I won't get into my personal opinions about Doug Ford, which I've commented on a few times on this podcast. They're not favorable, is that this was a politically motivated bill rather than an actual pragmatic, thought out, researched bill. So I'll turn it over to you, and you can start with wherever you want to start, Amber. So,
Okay. Well, I will start with the idea that we are a nonpartisan organization. So apologies, I should have said that at the outset, but we are a
that's all
not-for-profit,
right.
nonpartisan organization. And so we work with the governments of the day on various pieces of legislation that impact municipal budgets, of which obviously Bill 23 is a perfect example. One of the things that you mentioned in terms of the speed, I sort of calculated at about 25 business days between the introduction and the passage of this bill. And first and foremost, I think it's important to know that we do have a crisis in housing supply and affordability, and that the goal of 1.5 million homes by 2031 is a laudable one. We have a lot of elected officials that had put affordable housing as top of their list. Does it get us there? There are some concerns that we've got in sort of three buckets, as you mentioned. The financial piece, certainly. In terms of growing houses that need infrastructure to service those, whether it be sewer or wastewater, what have you, fire halls. There's a lot of costs that go into it, and I think the principle that growth pays for growth is something that we have a long-standing position on, because otherwise there's not that many other levers to get that to rejuvenate and make sure that those communities are built for it. The other things that I will say is on the planning issue. So we talk about community livability, and I think from an elected council point of view, they've got many roles. They advocate on behalf of the residents. They are stewards of the land in which they are governing, and they also have the ability to represent the interests. And so, from a community livability standpoint, there's also concerns about the changes made to the Planning Act, some of the other pieces to heritage, for instance, and then the environmental protection pieces in terms of the reduction in the roles of conservation authorities and regional governments overall. So there's a lot to unpack, as you mentioned. There's a lot of bills schedules to go through, and so what we're focused on is getting some of the ERO postings, so the regulatory postings, our thoughts down about what that could look like and what the implications might be.
And I read on one of the links that I when I was researching the topic, that you actually weren't, the AMO wasn't invited to contribute, or I guess, or speak to the concerns in terms of the council or whatever. Sorry, the staffing council or whatever was doing when they were doing the research.
The standing committee.
The standing committee. I'm sorry. Yes. In terms of giving, I mean, wouldn't you think that the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, that given what you just described in terms of the membership and the breadth and the width of this thing, wasn't asked to give their opinion, or at least their input, or in terms of, how a bill gets passed, right? And how it gets even how it even evolves. So, yeah.
So, as you say, we were not invited to speak. We did put forward a thought or a request, rather, to speak in front of it. But we did, the committee did hear from dozens of groups and individuals over those 4 days. We were invited by the official opposition, however, to present our submission to interested members of the legislature, though, through a virtual meeting. And so that's the submission that we sent also to all of the members of provincial parliament, that despite not necessarily being in that room, I think that we certainly got our message across, and have been talking to different ministries throughout to try to see how this bill gets implemented in the long term and short term, really.
Right, and I mean, listen, I've done real estate for 35 years. We don't know each other. We just met today, but I mean, I certainly have lived through this housing crises every day in terms of the different markets, the markets that we came out of, what we're entering into now, and the challenges that come with it in terms of affordable housing, not only just the lack of housing, and people sometimes equate the two as the same in terms of affordable housing and lack of housing, which is they're two distinct issues. That said, I'm a bit of a political junkie, and I always get very cynical when I hear this 1.5 million houses till 2031. And when you make a statement like it could be cost taxpayers up to $1 billion, let's face it, everyone pays attention when it's going to affect their tax dollars, right? When all of a sudden their tax bill is going to go up. And so talk us through, I guess, the immediate, I mean, I know there's various schedules to this bill and everything like that, but ultimately, they're trying to leap over some of these development charges, right? And here's where the rubber hits the road. And for those that do pay attention to this, and because I deal with all sectors, so I deal with the developer sector, I deal with the other sectors, and I know the biggest complaint from developers is the bureaucracy of the municipalities and the time that it takes and the payments and the blah blah blah. But here's where the rubber hits the road, because here's where the development charges actually make sense and actually contribute to something. Because you just said growth pays for growth, right? So comment on what's being skipped over, I guess, and where those costs get taken out of, if you could.
So I think the cumulative impact is really where I'd focus on, in terms of it's not only the development charges, but there's community benefit charges that are impacted for those that have them. There's also some parkland dedication fees that get into sort of the livability piece of it, to say that we should be building green spaces around to make sure that folks that are moving into those homes have a place. COVID is the best example of having outdoor space being very critical. But more importantly, like new homes need water, stormwater, roads, recreation, fire, libraries, as I say, and all those services to make communities attractive places. And so I think when the transfer of those funds, in terms of what services or inputs to those units come at a cost to the existing tax base, I think you'll find that there is a legitimate concern, not only for existing taxpayers, but the councils that are elected to serve those residents, that the money needs to come from somewhere. And traditionally, growth has paid for growth. And so that's where we're trying to choose our focus. On your issue on the affordable and attainable, I just wanted to speak to it because it's an important one. Municipalities deal with the full spectrum of housing. We were downloaded social housing, or community housing and social housing, rather, in the 1990s. And so there is a lot more than just market-based housing that we need to take into account and make sure that our residents at all levels of income have a place to stay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, and I guess the other piece of this too, because again, it's another example of federally dumping down on the provincially and the provincially dumping down on the municipalities. There's got to be a staffing issue to administer all of this. Right? I mean, it's not like these municipalities all of a sudden the planners can do more work, or the administrators for the planners, or the administrator for the whatever. Right? I mean, where's the staffing coming from to administer all of the legislation? Is that not an issue?
It's all connected. And you bring up, since 2018, there's been 3 housing supply action plans, and there's been 4 bills. It started back in Bill 108, and then Bill 197, Bill 109 in the spring, and then Bill 23. So, someone had mentioned today of it being a generational shift in planning. There is no doubt that there is a lot of changes that are coming at building officials, planners, obviously developers on the other side. Everyone needs to sort of work together to achieve this goal that the province has set. There are housing targets now that the ministry has put forward to the 29 largest municipalities, and so there's conversations about how that's going to get done. There's also the environmental postings about the environmental changes to things like wetlands and other policies that I think are taking up a lot of staff time to just make sure that they have the best advice going forward to the government in implementing these things, notwithstanding how fast this bill is moving. And so now that it's passed, I think we're moving into implementation. And is one of the main reasons why I think the Housing Supply Action Plan implementation team that the province had announced back in August, co-chaired by municipal mayors, one from the city of Windsor and one from the municipality of Hornpain, I think is a perfect venue to sort of start having these conversations now that we're past the bill's passage.
Right. And so, so now real life begins, and we have to logistically move through what this means in real life. So I know here from personally in Kingston, we're talking about now density changes, right? Or in zoning. So the bill, and please correct me, because obviously I'll be the first to admit I haven't read the bill. Really don't have a desire to read the bills, no offense, but we're now I guess, skipping over the Planning Act, as you at least there's sections of it that sort of bypass the Planning Act in terms of creating these new zoning official. I mean, so because like Kingston had their official plan. So now the majority of these municipalities have an official plan. So now presumably they'll have to amend all of these official plans to adhere to the legislation. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I think there are a lot of changes that municipalities are going to have to implement, not only from this recent piece of legislation, but Bill 109, because there are a lot of things that come into effect starting next year, for instance. But in terms of the planning, there's a lot of complex changes that have been made that just frankly need time for the planners to really understand what this means, what does need to change in their municipality, how do they start educating residents and developers in their communities about these changes. And I think that is one of the most pressing things for myself, and I think the councils that I continue to serve, is this idea that with change needs time to sort of catch up. And the more shifting sands, it really complicates what is already a complex Planning Act. And so we just need time to recognize what the legislative changes, both in the Planning Act, the Heritage Act, the changes to the Ontario Land Tribunal Act, all of those things, what does that look like? And of course, with the Conservation Authorities Act as well, and who's doing what now, given that there's reduced roles in planning, both at the regional level for some of them and for CAs.
So from your perspective, and you're nonpartisan, and as you've stated and everything like that, I mean, apart from the initial shock of this, and like you said, I mean, 25 days from inception to legislation, are there positives to this?
Yes.
Yeah, so let's talk about those.
There are a few, and with some caveats for certain. I think one of the things that we've always been talking about is the need for density over sprawl. So there was a reaction to additional dwelling units and residential units. And so partly that helps the density question. It also included some capacity building for the Ontario Land Tribunal to get rid of some of their backlog of cases, which we also found helpful. And some of the density pieces around transit as well. So those are sort of some of the pieces. But as I say, on the other side of things, there's a lot of double-edged swords and so to say. So that's where I'll stop for those ones.
Well, no, fair enough, because, and you touched on it, because, I mean, let's break this down to its sort of, I guess, most common denominator. I mean, we're talking about, yes, okay, high level, 1.5 million houses. What does that translate into? But you're right. You're talking about now municipalities, you're talking about communities, you're talking about neighborhoods. You're talking about a piece of property that all of a sudden had potentially nothing on it to now, I don't know, 30 units, 50 units, 100 units, whatever, right? So now you're impacting a neighborhood. Now you're impacting where people do their groceries, how they commute in and out of that area, how they, right? All of those other all of those other sort of variables that sort of get affected by the implementation or a shovel going in the ground. So from legislation to shovel in the ground, and you just discussed that the municipalities need some time to digest all of this, the planners need some time to digest all of this. Realistically, from where you sit, and based on your experiences, what are the realities of this thing flowing through? And what if, take off your AMO hat for a second or whatever, but knowing what you know, where do you see this going? Like, how do you see this playing out in terms of actual number of units being built or houses being built? And like you said, you're talking about municipalities with less than 900 people. You're talking municipalities with over 100,000 people. Where does that get me to meet?
The best place to start is what the province has suggested is where those 1.5 million houses are going. Their 2031 targets lay out the biggest chunk, which would be the 1,229,000, I think, homes that are going to those ones. And specifically, I can't speak to the shovel readiness and how each of them are going to be forwarded, because there's a lot of factors that, quite frankly, are not even they're external to municipalities. Right? We've got supply chain shortages. shortages, we've got labor shortages, we've got the cost of building going up. And so all of those sorts of factors, we're obviously at the front end of, quote unquote, putting that shovel in the ground, but there's a lot of pieces, quite frankly, way well ahead of those things to make sure that shovel can go in. And so what we're focused on is educating our municipalities with hopefully our minister partners to educate them on what needs to happen and what the focus is. I think part of the interest from municipalities is going to say, okay, what does this all look like holistically, and what does the rest of that housing supply action plan 3.0 look like, and how are those going to get rolled out? But recognizing that again, our elected officials, many of them are still being sworn in. A lot of the councils just started in November 15th and onwards. Obviously, the election preceded that, but I think a lot of folks are just sort of turning their minds to the sequencing, prioritizing, and what this looks like in the new world.
Right, and there's another sub-layer to that, in which there's a lot of council members now, and even mayors that are brand new to this, right? That have even never had any experience. So add that as another little layer to all of this funneling down. And so I'm going to go a little bit off topic, stray a little bit, in the sense that, part and parcel of this legislation, it wasn't part of this actual legislation, but this whole other giving certain mayors extra powers to be able to, I guess, veto and or make decisions or fast track to, if a council was either deadlocked or wasn't enough votes or what have you. I mean, add that to the mix, because obviously every municipality is different, right? So now you're talking about individuals making decisions based on what? Personal preference, based on who they know, who they don't know. I mean, I'm sorry, I hate to sound cynical, but I've done this for 35 years. I've lived in this municipality, and I'm not saying anything disparaging about Kingston or anything like that, but I also know that it's a world of, hands get shaken, things happen, right? So where do you reconcile all of that, I guess?
Well, I think the government had said that adding strong mayor powers to the Municipal Act will help solve this problem. It seems unlikely. I mean, in a survey that we had put forward, recently conducted, 77% of our mayors and 95% of our municipal councillors from cities, towns, and villages had said no thank you to those new powers. So we're not opposed to strong mayor powers, but AMO is opposed to measures that allow the politicizing of municipal public administration. And the latest development in Bill 39, which is the one that was introduced most recently, and we're speaking to that tomorrow, that would allow a mayor to make law with the support of just a third of the council. So more to say on that, but at that point, that's where we're sort of at.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's why I brought that up. You're very good at, you're really good. You should actually maybe have a career running for public office then at some point. So, I don't want to keep you, because I'm positive you're very busy and you've got a lot of meetings in the course of a day, and I appreciate the time you're taking here now. So I guess, at the end of the day, like we said, and we've talked about, I'm going to ask you to put your, crystal ball, I guess, or get your crystal ball out. And here's the other thing. This legislation, I mean, I guess they have a majority government, so it won't get repealed at least in the next 4 years. But conceivably, this could get, if another government comes into power in 4 years' time or whenever the next election is, this could get all repealed, conceivably. But how do you see this unfolding? Do you see any real-time, real-life benefits in the next foreseeable 4 years of this government's mandate, I guess? And then I'm not trying to make it a difficult question. I'm just trying to say, hey, if you and I were having a coffee today at Starbucks and we were talking about this, what's your opinion on that? Like, is it going to help Ontarians? Is it going to help municipalities? Is it going to help those that need the housing as it's intended to, as the legislation's intended to do?
What I'd say is there's many facets to it. I think time will tell in terms of how, just like any legislation. But I think from AMO's perspective, our priorities remain making sure that our members are equipped, well resourced, able to implement these changes, given that they are in place now. And so part of the struggle I think that some municipalities have is that knowing that this is in now, what does that look like? So I think bringing new councils up to speed, as well as educating them on what their role was, what their role could be, is sort of top for us. The other thing is this idea to continue to advocate for the full spectrum of housing. As I say, it's one piece of the puzzle. It's an important one, but there are many, many residents in our communities. I know in Toronto, where I sit today, there's a lot of people struggling, and so it cannot just be part of a market-based housing conversation for us. And then the other thing is we're hoping that the ministry and developers alike also look in their own backyards to say, now that municipalities are implementing these changes, how can we best work together? And we will always be collaborative, and that's why we've put forward our solutions. We'll continue to participate in those postings as much as possible, so that if and when the government comes to us to ask our opinions, it will be well researched and well founded, and certainly representative of all of our members as to the best of our ability. Being one person here today as part of a slightly larger team.
Yeah, no, and you're fantastic. You are like, that's great. I appreciate that comment. So, and just I'm gonna go right back to the very beginning, because AMOs have been in existence for, well, I couldn't even believe that, 18 whatever. Yeah. That's unfathomable. But how big is your organization, and how many, I guess who's paying for this? Obviously it's a not-for-profit. So where are the funds coming from? How big a staff do you have? And can we get a bit of an insight into your infrastructure and how it operates?
So we have probably all told a group of about 40, but on the policy side, we have about 10. And we get our revenue from a variety of sources, mostly our AMO and our AMO conferences that we host every August. And then through training and education that we put on as well. But we are not funded by the provincial government, and that's why we're separate and distinct from them. And so that's probably what I would say in terms of how we're situated.
Yeah, no, and you're providing, I guess, counsel and research to the municipalities in terms of all of this legislation and I guess the interpretation of it and what that means in real terms and in real life.
That's right.
and then the I guess the pragmatics of it, if you will, or how it the actual legislative piece of it, and then how that translates into your municipality then. Right?
That's right. And I think the other thing that is important is that our board is made up of elected officials. And so we bring forward staff reports for their endorsement. And we also work through policy task forces to make sure that what I'm even bringing to you or bringing to our board is something that they've endorsed and are comfortable with the positions that we're taking. We're quite nimble as a team, I would say, because we're so small. And so each of the senior advisors have upwards of 5 ministries that we work with on any given day. So this one just seems to be cumulatively about 4 or 5 ministries at one time. So happy to see it and just happy to provide the best advice that the policy staff can to our members who are elected, and then obviously through their staff as well, who we work quite closely with.
Yeah. And I think that's awesome. And like I said, I didn't even know until today that this organization existed. So I apologize in advance for that, but I think that's fantastic, and I applaud you for the work that you do. Because our municipalities need it, especially those that are in those demographics that are smaller than the larger, because of course you're dealing with literally people homegrown people, right? I mean, I guess
That's
not
right.
to say that disparagingly but just descriptively in terms of these are people that have volunteered their time and their effort and every day to try to make a difference. And then they get caught up in all of these levels of legislation and bureaucracy, I guess. So, well, listen, I want to wish you the best of luck. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate the conversation. If anything, I hope it's awakened those that listen and those that hear this to Bill 23, because I dare say there's a lot of people that this would have flown completely under the radar. And so with that, hopefully it gets people talking and people thinking about it anyway. So thank you very much for your time, Amber. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right. Have a good rest of this miserable day. Go home and get warm and yes, all of that. So thanks
Thank you
very
so
much.
much. Take care.
Take care.